Hello, I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer. Welcome to Gospel Minded, an outreach of Benedictus Psychological Services. Interested in psychology, rooted in a Catholic Christian anthropology? Check out benedictuspsych.com. Here on Gospel Minded, we spend a few minutes each week talking about psychology, our emotions, attitudes, beliefs, behavioral health, and we reflect on how these important topics are related to the Sunday Gospel reading each week. Now, this is no substitute for actually getting yourself to Mass or going to church or participating in counseling or therapy or spiritual direction if you're involved with those sort of practices. But like we know so well, things of our psychology and our mind so often go beautifully hand in hand with our spirituality. If this is your first time checking out Gospel Minded in this channel, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. Either way, I hope that you'll hit subscribe and like, and that way you'll never miss an episode of Gospel Minded or any of the other episodes that are on. So friends, we made it through the octave of Easter. I hope it was a beautiful and wonderful week of celebrating and rejoicing for you. And so now this second Sunday of Easter, Divine Mercy Sunday, we have that great gospel reading where we hear about Jesus' presence among the apostles and then Thomas, that story of doubting Thomas. I don't know if that's the best way to characterize him as somebody who is doubting. Maybe we'll say skeptical Thomas. Have a listen to some of the reading from today from the gospel. It says this. It says, on the first day of the week, when the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord, and Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven, and whose sins you retain are retained." Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples said to him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into the nail marks, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Now, a week later, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Jesus came, although the doors were locked, and stood in their midst and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and bring your hand and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believe." Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to them, "Have you come to believe because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." It's an astonishing gospel passage, and I think one that gives us so much to discuss. But I think as I reflected on today's gospel reading, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about skepticism. I think I'm kind of skeptical, and I don't think it's bad to have a healthy bit of skepticism. But what I have noticed within myself and what I've noticed when I work with people as a therapist, it seems like there is unhealthy skepticism and healthy skepticism. So let's just talk about what distinguishes those two for a second. I mean, healthy skepticism and unhealthy skepticism both involve this process of questioning information, sure, but they differ significantly in the motivation that drives it, perhaps the emotional tone, the psychological effects. I actually jotted down a few notes here because I think this is an important topic. Let's talk about some of the characteristics psychologically of a person who is healthy with their skepticism. So a person who is skeptical in a helpful or more healthy way tends to be curious. So there's this idea of questioning the information, but there's a tone and a sense of curiosity about it, and a sense of open-mindedness. So the person who is a healthy skeptic will indeed question things, but they're willing to be convinced when there is good evidence. Their thinking is like critical thinking, and that's what drives them. It's critical thinking. So they want proof, and they're going to evaluate the data fairly. And I think that is perfectly reasonable. And a person who is skeptical in this healthy way wants proof and is going to analyze it and judge it in a fair manner. This is a big one. I think the person who is skeptical in a healthy way tends to be emotionally regulated. So there isn't a sense of panic or paranoia or anger, but the person who is skeptical in a healthy way tends to be calm as they try to analyze and make sense of the information that they're processing. They can be flexible. They can change their mind when new information comes in. They trust, and they trust in a way that's calibrated to the evidence that they have. So they aren't automatically distrustful of people, but they weigh their trust based on behavior of others, facts, what they have come to ascertain by judging the evidence that they've got. And then ultimately, the outcome of a person who is skeptical in a more healthy manner, they tend to make better decisions. They tend to be more resilient. There tends to be more intellectual growth. So these, I think, are some of the main highlights and some of the chief characteristics of a person who is skeptical but in a healthy way. And as I was talking about these, boy, does that not sound like Thomas from the gospel. Because let's be real, were one of my family members or friends to come up to me and say, hey, you remember such and such who died not too long ago? Yeah, they came back to life and I saw them today. I think it's fair for Thomas to have been skeptical, rightly so. And if I had heard something similar, I also would have been skeptical. But remember what I said, a person who is skeptical in a healthy way is going to be open-minded. They're going to be critical thinking, sure, and they're going to evaluate the data in a fair way. They're emotionally regulated. They're flexible, so they'll change their mind when the new information comes in. So what happens this next week? Then the door is locked, and yet Jesus appears in their midst. And so already, Thomas must have been thinking something and feeling some kind of way, because holy smokes, now I too am seeing what these others have seen. And Jesus says to him, Thomas, come put your hand in my side and put your finger through the nail marks. That's some pretty good evidence that what the apostles had said just a week before was real. So Thomas changes. He says, my Lord. And Jesus says, you believe because you have seen. And that's fair. A person who is skeptical may want some proof, and it's fair to come to believe based on the evidence and the data that we have seen. Hopefully we can be willing to take that further step and take some things on faith, but healthy skepticism, tends to look this sort of way. There's a receptivity to new information that comes in. Now, all of this is essentially the opposite of what a person who is skeptical in an unhealthy or unhelpful way kind of looks like. So, for example, a person who is unhealthy in their skepticism, it tends to be fear-driven and just overly cynical. I notice that when people are overly skeptical in an unhelpful way, that it kind of comes from this place of almost automatic distrust of others, of people, of places, of organizations or things. There's this distrust, this anger, this sort of fear. It's not curiosity, and it's not wanting to expand, develop, learn more. There is no open-mindedness. It tends to have this very cynical approach to it. There's closed-mindedness with a person who is skeptical in an unhealthy way. They're not willing to uh, flex even a little bit. So even when there's good evidence, a person who is unhealthy in their skepticism is just going to dismiss it. Doesn't matter. I am convinced that were Jesus to appear to somebody today who is a skeptic in an unhealthy way, that they could put their finger through the hole in Jesus's hands and they still would not believe and still would dismiss that evidence and come up with some kind of reason why it can't be believed. What I've noticed so often with people who are overly skeptical is that it's very emotionally driven. That anger, that distrust, and maybe there's reason for it. Perhaps they've been hurt before. Perhaps they've put themselves out in a different time and they got burned because of not being skeptical enough. And so now the skepticism that they manifest is sort of an overreaction. There are a lot of reasons why it could be, but I have so often noticed that the skepticism is emotionally charged. There's a rigidness. The mind is made up even before they've had a chance to look at new data or new evidence and analyze it or try to make sense of it. And what's the outcome? Ultimately, what I have seen more times than not is the person who is so overly skeptical, they kind of isolate. They can be stressed. There can be cognitive distortions. Everyone's out to get me. My spouse, my partner, my family, my friends, they don't love me anymore. Even if there's evidence against all of these things, the person who is hyper skeptical is going to dismiss that evidence, and it's going to lead to not great outcomes. So in simple terms, healthy skepticism, curious, evidence-seeking, not emotionally driven. Unhealthy skepticism, fearful, defensive, resistant to evidence. So, Thomas, I think a healthy skeptic, and I hope that you too, myself, can be skeptical in a healthy way. We don't want to just believe everything based on face value. It's good to make judgments based on data and to analyze what is presented to us. And I hope that it can also help us to grow in faith, help us to grow in faith of the Lord, be able to have faith and trust in the people around us. Either way, my hope and prayer is that we'll be blessed now as we continue in our Easter season, and that we will come to accept that evidence that we do have and we believe to be true, that our Lord has risen from the dead, who loves you and me and wants what's best for us. So I hope you found this helpful and useful. I think it's great stuff to talk about, and I hope that you'll come with me next time here on Gospel Minded. Until then, I'll pray for you. I ask you to pray for me. I'm Dr. Garrett Boyer. This is Gospel Minded. Take care.